In October of 1929, the stock market in the United States crashed. The causes are complicated and still controversial, but the widespread practice of borrowing money from banks for speculation in the market was certainly a factor. Between early October and early November, the stock market lost over 40% of its value. A wave of confusion and fear led people to withdraw their money from banks, and this in turn caused nearly 6,000 banks to fail. The subsequent contraction of credit led to businesses failing and loss of employment. Rising unemployment meant less spending and more layoffs, and the situation snowballed into the most severe economic downturn in American history. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 raised tariffs on imports and led other countries to retaliate. Trade between the U.S. and other countries fell by over 50%. Agricultural exports dropped drastically, and the ensuing fall in prices led to many farmers abandoning production and even leaving their farms. Entire families became migrants looking for work wherever they could find it. The unemployment rate approached 25%, and millions more were only marginally employed. There was, of course, no unemployment compensation at this time. During the 1932 presidential election campaign, Franklin Roosevelt promised to change things. He differed from incumbent President Herbert Hoover in that he did not believe action should be controlled by an ideology of limited government. He won 57% of the vote and carried all but 6 states. He immediately began his New Deal for the American people. Roosevelt started by reopening many banks under government supervision. The public reacted favorably, and deposits began to flow back into the banking system. The Glass-Steagal Act was passed to regulate banking speculation and established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to insure deposits, thus stopping runs on banks by nervous depositors. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created to employ young men to plant trees, fight erosion, and build roads in rural areas. The National Industrial Recovery Act authorized the regulation of production in order to raise prices and gave unions the right to organize without coercion by owners. Other programs funded both private contractors and public projects to employ workers building roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, and dams. The National Recovery Administration brought labor and industry together in an effort to set minimum wages and prices in order to stabilize markets. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration was launched to increase commodity prices by compensating farmers for reducing production. Roosevelt used radio broadcasts to address the nation in what became known as fireside chats. And although the New Deal was not successful on all fronts, things did get better. Industrial production was up by 55% by 1935, and 4 million more workers were employed by that year compared to the low point of 1933. The price of agricultural products recovered enough so that farming was viable again. In addition to President Roosevelt, labor unions had 2 other powerful allies during the 1930s. Both were women. Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, personally attended labor meetings and earned great respect for her willingness to enter even the dirtiest and most dangerous of workplaces. President Roosevelt appointed Frances Perkins to be Secretary of Labor. She was the first woman to hold a cabinet position in the U.S. government. Throughout her career, she was a staunch supporter of labor unions. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 guaranteed the right to organize unions, to bargain collectively, and to strike. It created the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, to oversee union representation elections and to prosecute violations of the Act. After long years of struggle, labor unions finally had some legal protections needed to stand up to management and to organize. The impact was huge. This act eliminated many legal obstructions to union organization, such as injunctions, and put in place significant barriers to employer interference with union activities. The Social Security Act also passed in 1935. It was a landmark achievement that provided a basic level of support for working people in their later years. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established a minimum wage, maximum hours, overtime pay, and prohibitions on most forms of child labor. It took over a century, but the horrible practice of using children in the industrial workplace was finally banned. In a few short years, labor had gone from near bankruptcy to a position of near equal footing with the companies they had struggled with for so long. Roosevelt's efforts on labor's behalf won him huge popularity among working people. The 1930s did have its share of strikes and sometimes violent actions around union organizing. During the Minneapolis trucker strike of 1934, pitched battles were waged in the streets between the striking Teamsters and police supported by a local business militia. Several deaths occurred on both sides before a federal mediator was able to obtain a settlement that won the Teamsters' primary demands, including recognition of the union. This trucker strike turned into a citywide general strike. Similar citywide strikes also occurred that year in San Francisco and Toledo. The AFL's policy of organizing only skilled workers, known as craft unionism, left out the vast majority of working people. During the 1930s, the AFL was urged to change this approach, but the conservative leaders did little to alter their strategies. Shortly after an open dispute at the AFL convention in 1935, John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers joined with other disaffected leaders to form the CIO, the Committee of Industrial Organizations. A few years later, the CIO broke away from the AFL, became the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and grew rapidly by organizing unions in steel, rubber, glass, electronics, autos, and many other industries. The AFL responded by vigorously increasing its organizing efforts, and the competition led to enormous growth for both groups. At the end of 1937, the AFL claimed 3,400,000 members, and the CIO 3,700,000 members. An episode during the Republic Steel Strike in 1937 shows that violence against working people was not over yet, even with a labor-friendly administration in Washington. During a peaceful march of Union sympathizers carrying the American flag, Chicago police fired on the crowd and continued firing as people fled. 10 marchers were killed and dozens wounded. Many were clubbed by the police and suffered head injuries. Although photographs showed the violent beatings, none of the police were charged with any wrongdoing. In its efforts to unionize the auto industry, a new tactic was employed by the United Automobile Workers at the General Motors body plant in Flint, Michigan. The union occupied the plant in what was called a sit-down strike. This meant taking control of the facility and keeping management and potential replacement workers out. A local judge did issue an injunction against the union, but the Michigan governor and the Roosevelt administration were sympathetic to the union, and no action was taken to remove the strikers. The governor served as an intermediary between the company and the union, and John Lewis of the CIO helped with negotiations. In February of 1937, GM signed an agreement recognizing the union. This victory for the UAW and the CIO eventually led to the unionization of the entire auto industry, and the UAW quickly grew to include 500,000 members. The steel industry had resisted union organization for decades, but after seeing that government was no longer going to back management, the head of U.S. Steel decided to avoid a costly battle. Just 3 weeks after the UAW General Motors settlement, U.S. Steel signed an agreement and recognized the Steelworkers Organizing Committee as the bargaining agent for its workers. Within just a few months, many other steel companies followed, and by the end of the year, the union claimed over 300,000 members. Roosevelt's relief efforts did reduce the suffering of the American people, but the impact of the Depression lingered until the start of World War II. It is generally agreed that massive government spending by many nations on war materials led to higher employment levels and general economic recovery. With so many men mobilized for war, unemployment in the U.S. dropped from a high of almost 25% in 1933 to under 2% in 1943. During World War II, business and labor generally cooperated and both profited. Union membership surged from around 9 million in 1940 to nearly 15 million by 1945. While labor actions declined in order to support the war effort, not all was peaceful. Among the notable exceptions was coal mining, where conditions became even more dangerous due to pressures to increase production. The militancy of the United Mine Workers and John L. Lewis led to public disapproval and the passage of legislation empowering the government to take over industries where strikes impacted war production. As happened in World War I, with so many men drafted into the military to fight the Second World War, a huge change took place in the makeup of those working back home. Women and minorities, often excluded from the better-paying positions, were once again hired to take over jobs traditionally held only by white men. It is a fact that throughout American history, many employers and some unions discriminated against minorities. The CIO changed this in the late 1930s when they organized the steel and auto industries, and more than 500,000 black people were union members by 1945. A. Philip Randolph, an early black labor leader who had organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, was instrumental in pressuring President Roosevelt to issue a landmark executive order in 1941. A key part of this order stated, quote, "I do hereby reaffirm the policy of the United States that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin." Unquote. Eleanor Roosevelt also pushed the administration to do more for minorities. Between 1936 and 1939, participation of black people in the Civilian Conservation Corps rose from 6% to 11%. Mary Mcleod Bethune, appointed as Director of Negro Affairs in the National Youth Administration, was the first African American to lead a government agency. As part of the growing labor movement, the Mexican Farm Labor Union and the Confederation of Mexican Farmers and Workers Unions organized agricultural workers in California and succeeded in gaining wage hikes. Mexican women in Los Angeles organized under the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Their strike in 1933 won a contract that included recognition of the union and higher wages. While strikes and union demands were limited during the war, this changed dramatically when the war ended. Corporate profits had risen dramatically, along with the cost of living, while wages had only increased slightly. Unions demanded pay increases. President Truman called a conference in November 1945, but was not able to bring agreement between labor and management. In the 12 months following the end of the war, there were over 4,600 work stoppages involving over 5 million workers. Faced with a national crisis, President Truman put in place fact-finding boards and handed down rulings that were grudgingly accepted by labor and management, and the huge wave of strikes gradually dissipated. The return to a peacetime economy moved ahead, and the settlements of 1946 established a sort of standoff between labor and management. For the next several decades, American industry led the world, and as productivity and profits grew, corporations wanted to avoid costly strikes, and were often willing to negotiate union contracts leading to higher wages and increased benefits. This is not to suggest that corporate America was willing to simply accept the increased power of unions. Business interests created a potent propaganda campaign depicting unions as self-serving and irresponsible, and again portrayed the labor movement as associated with extremism and communism. While some union officials were connected with the Communist Party, their influence within the labor movement was limited. The AFL and the CIO were, in fact, bitterly criticized by the Communists as being too conservative in political terms. However, after the post-war wave of strikes, the public was receptive to the anti-union message. Republicans won complete control of Congress in 1946 and passed the Taft-Hartley Act over the veto of President Truman. This act, which was largely authored by the National Association of Manufacturers and the National Chamber of Commerce, gave employers more powers to fight unions and placed new restrictions on union activities. It brought back injunctions, allowed for employer interference in representation elections, allowed restrictions on mass picketing, outlawed secondary boycotts, and made union officers take an oath declaring they were not communists. It also gave states the power to ban union security clauses, thereby opening the way for so-called right-to-work laws, wherein workers covered by a union contract are not obligated to pay any union dues for union representation. Many states, especially in the South, did pass right-to-work legislation, and this made the organization and maintenance of unions far more difficult.